All right, so here we are at chapter 5. Today we're going to be looking at classical and neoclassical perspectives of criminology. Essentially what we're going to be looking at is some of the history and the roots of where we get our modern criminological theory. So we're going to start off by looking at perspectives. And a perspective is just simply a framework of a way to explain something like crime. So for instance, in this course, we're going to be looking at several different frameworks. We're going to be looking at biological frameworks, psychological frameworks, and those both look at the micro or look at the individual. And then obviously we have a major heavy emphasis on the sociological frameworks. The sociological frameworks look at how the environment influences people's, or chances for engaging in criminal behavior. So I'm going to use my little ink pen here just to give you an idea of how this looks like. So think of a perspective as kind of an umbrella, or perspective is a bigger umbrella. And then your theories are underneath here. So for instance, if we're using a sociological perspective, we might say something like, I have a theory that people who live in or experience high rates of poverty are more likely to engage in criminality. Or I might say something like, kids who hang out with other bad kids are more likely to engage in criminality. And so you can see that overarchingly we're using sociological explanations, but of course the theories around them are pretty different. For instance, you might have people that live in poverty who don't engage in criminality. So you would also be really interested in why they don't, because most people don't, but are more likely to. So again, theories are just ways of explaining certain types of crimes. Some theories have, are very, very strong. Others have weaknesses. And it's really important that we are also critical. Generally, what I find is that some theories work really well for certain types of crime. So poverty might be a great explanation for things like property crime. People steal because they don't have the money to afford these products themselves. Now, I don't know if poverty would be the best explanation for explaining violent crime, even though we do find more violent crime amongst people who live in poverty. Some explanations for that are that there's like the culture of poverty, which leads people like just feeling really low about themselves, not giving them a lot of outlets. We can look at the culture of masculinity, right? And that, essentially we socialize our young boys to be masculine, be dominant. I think it's pretty interesting, right? We put a toy gun or a toy sword or some other type of killing device into our hands of our very, very small children, and then we say don't be violent. So it's kind of interesting. And then we put babies. We give our little girls babies and we say don't get pregnant, don't be violent. It's kind of funny, our culture. Anyways. But again, so there might be many different ways that are contributing to high levels of violence, even in low-income areas. I think a lot of it might have to do with that idea of, being a man, providing, and when you aren't given those opportunities, you're not going to be very happy. I don't think any of us would. So just to give you an example of how we might look at, just another example, if you looked at eating disorders, for instance, which is one of the examples mentioned in the book, from a micro or psychological level, we might say something like, maybe this individual has low self-esteem or lack of self-control. Maybe they are looking for immediate gratification. So those would all be examples of how we can look at eating disorders from a psychological perspective. But we might also look at it from a sociological perspective. So for one, eating disorders are very unique to the U.S. You do see it in other westernized countries, but we are leading the game when it comes to this. So in looking at things a little bit more critically, we might look at things like the media. Oftentimes the images that women are getting in magazines, social media, and things like that are really unattainable because they're not even real women. They've been photoshopped so much. There's a great documentary that I show my students, and they talk about how Cindy Crawford says that she would really like to look like Cindy Crawford because obviously she's been retouched up so much that it doesn't even, it looks very alien to her. So again, here we've looked at it from a sociological level, we've looked at it from a psychological level. We might also say, like from a feminist perspective, that women's bodies are used to sell products and they're exploited in a certain way. But then, we internalize these images and we go, well, that's what a woman is supposed to look like and things like that. And obviously we know what's presented to us, that doesn't really look like real women anyway. So here we'll go over the chapter objectives. And of course, that, just to remind you, chapter objectives are there to keep you kind of engaged with like the main points of the chapter. So here's what we want to do. We want to be able to understand the context of classical and neoclassical perspectives. We want to become familiar with the historical development of explanations of crime and deviance, from theology to science, including the dawn of Age of Reason, the development of the classical school of criminology, and the rise of positivism. We want to be familiar with the neoclassical perspectives, including rational choice theory, deterrence theory, and routine activities theory. So today we're going to start off talking about some of the history of where this all comes from. It really started at the Age of Reason, or the Age of Enlightenment. But overall, I want you to remember that theories are trying to answer a particular question. So I have a couple questions to present to you. So the first is, why are some people more likely to commit crime than others? That's question number one. We also want to look at why some categories of people are more likely to engage in criminality as well when it comes to things like race, class, gender, age. All of those demographics come into play. We're also interested in why crime is more common in certain areas. What is it about particular areas that is perpetuating criminality? Right. So before the Age of Reason, most people attributed crime and criminality to the gods and the demons. And they believed essentially that God was really testing the faith of these individuals. Some people believed that God was punishing the individuals in some way, or that God was using their behavior to warn others. And then in another sense, the belief was that people were essentially just possessed by demons. And you can tell during this time that the people weren't using a lot of logic or rationale. They were really leaving it up to higher powers, but there was no real explanation as to why, these people were engaging in such high amounts of criminality. So during the Age of the Enlightenment, this is when philosophers and people studying crime and deviance started to really challenge medieval thought that God was directly controlling humans. And they started to believe that, no, you know how it is? People have their own free will, and they are governing their own affairs. During this time, the great thinkers really stressed education as a way to develop a reasoning ability. And in some ways, this is a little foreign to us because this is, our culture is, setting this forth with modern day education. But it always wasn't that way, and not everyone had an education, prior to during the Age of Enlightenment even, but especially prior to that time. Okay, so during the Age of the Enlightenment, we had several great thinkers, and they just had different theories as to why, how things were set up within the human mind. Thomas Hobbes was one of them, and he believed that essentially humans were born bad, right? That we have this like hedonistic side that just, wanted more, all this pleasure, and we didn't really care about the amount of pain that we inflicted on others. Thomas Hobbes believed that we really needed the state or the government to set up rules to keep people in line. Next, we had John Locke. If you remember Locke from economics, John Locke believed, it's neither good nor bad. He believed that he's the one who coined the term, I think, tabula rasa, which was the idea of humans being a blank state. He believed that it was the experience that shaped individuals. So going back to this time, John Locke was very much a sociologist without, calling himself that. And then lastly, we have Jean-Jacques Rousseau, and he believed that the state also needed to limit your freedom because, we were inherently bad. All right. So, during the age of the Enlightenment, when it came to criminality and criminology, we had two main thinkers. We had Caesar Beccaria, and Jeremy Bentham. And both started looking at what's known as hedonistic calculus, and the idea that human beings would calculate whether behavior would cause more pleasure or pain. And they believe that to deter crime, you would need to, the punishment for a particular crime would need to be harsh enough to deter that particular act. Critics of what's known as deterrence theory, which was the idea that you have a really harsh punishment, believed that these theorists were being overly simplistic. They thought, not everyone, if you think about a crime of passion or an emotional crime or someone getting upset and hurting someone, oftentimes people aren't sitting there and weighing out the costs and the benefits. And even in that sense, maybe even if they took a second, they wouldn't even care because they have so much emotion and so much, they're upset, right? They also found that it didn't account for differences within demographics. So if you look at something like the death penalty, so the death penalty is a pretty harsh punishment. But for deterrence theory to work, it has to be swift and certain, meaning it has to be carried out quite quickly. If you know anything about the death penalty in the United States, because of the appeals process, it's a very, very lengthy time before someone is actually put to death. The death penalty is also not certain, meaning there are plenty of people who do horrendous, crimes, homicides, maybe even worse, and don't get put on, maybe because of the state they live in, or I don't know, because of other characteristics, they don't end up getting put to death. Maybe the jury didn't believe in it or something like that. There are all kinds of things. So it's not always certain. Not everyone will receive the same punishment. We also know that the death penalty has demographic characteristics. So for instance, when the perpetrator is black and the victim is white, the jury is more likely to use something like the death penalty. So there are definitely some racial discriminatory parts of it as well. All right, so next we have the positivist school. Positivism is built on two main principles, which are acceptance and social determination. So this really was held in the belief that human behavior was determined by forces beyond a human being's control. So that there was something inherent or inside the individual that was causing deviance or criminality. So as you can know, the positivist school rejects notions of free will, believing that human behavior is predisposed. So the idea behind these ideas was that those who broke the law were abnormal, they were evolutionary throwbacks, and during this time, this is when philosophers realized or wanted to start using the scientific method to evaluate like physical and social characteristics of the world. And so it became, it is what became known as pseudoscience. So they would do things because they couldn't take brain scans or stuff like this during this time. They would study physical characteristics such as head size or body type, stuff like that. So it doesn't really work that way. So now we know that, but they thought they were using a scientific model to engage with these ideas. And if you can imagine, the positivist school carries some really harsh connotations. The idea that if something, if criminality was inherent within individuals, then maybe we should just get rid of certain individuals, because the idea that would, support the idea that criminality, was passed down through genes or through families or something like that. And so this was the belief, which led to what's known as the eugenics movement. And the eugenics movement in the US was forced sterilization of certain individuals who were deemed undesirable, or people who, were thought to be degenerate or would carry that criminal gene. And so even in the US, there are people who are still alive today who were forcefully sterilized by the government. And again, the whole idea is that they wouldn't have any progeny, and so it would keep the criminality from moving on. Scary enough, Hitler took a lot of our eugenics ideas and amplified them, and that's his basis for the Holocaust, right? The idea that Jewish people were inferior to others. And obviously, slavery, American slavery, has its basis in these ideas as well. So, again, kind of shows, um, sometimes we think we're using science and we're really, really not. So here we are. We're going to shift gears a little bit. Now we're going to look at that classical school. So the classical school was really based on that idea of criminality being outside of the individual, or its roots being social. And so here you see things like rational choice theory, that idea that people, or related to deterrence theory. It assumes that people will choose to commit crime after calculating whether the pain outweighs the pleasure, or whatever, or pleasure outweighs the pain. So again, it's in the name. They're making a rational choice. They're thinking about it. Again, this aligns very much with deterrence theory, where the harsher the punishment, the less people would commit these crimes because they fear arrest or whatever, death penalty or whatever it is. But of course, some of the criticisms of rational choice theory is that decision making can be imperfect. For instance, we know with the war on drugs, I can assume that most people, their perceptions were not that their first drug offense would get them 5 years. I think most people would think it would get them about 6 months to a year. So, that punishment was way off what they thought. So it wouldn't have really worked because, they weren't thinking things over, they didn't have the real information. So we can also evaluate rational choice theory. Sometimes, in being critical of it, we can say that sometimes even severe punishments still don't deter crime. For like the death penalty, like we talked about, those crimes of passion, homicide, or aggravated assault. We even know that even after people enter into the criminal justice system, sometimes punishment can actually increase with their punishment, or sometimes offending can increase with their punishment. So let's think about that. You enter into the criminal, you go into a prison. Most people will be forced to join a gang for protection. So now you went in there for drugs, but now you're a gang member. And who knows, you might come out, still a gang member. And obviously, maybe you might become a better criminal while you're in there because you're hanging around other criminals. We even know, for instance, correctional guards are more likely to engage in deviance and criminality because they're hanging out with criminals every day, right? If you watch enough of those shows, you'll know. We also know that after people are incarcerated, they face a stigma. It's very hard to get a job. You have to mark that you're a convicted felon, things like that. So is it really deterring others? I don't know. Because if you look at our recidivism rates, and recidivism refers to the idea of how many people will be reincarcerated after they are let out. So within 6 months, 67% of prisoners will be back in the system. So they will be confined in prison again. So they will reoffend. So Rational choice theory sounds really good. It's not really working, probably because it's not, in its truest form. There are so many complexities involved. All right, then our last slide here, we're going to talk a little bit more about deterrence. And so most of the neoclassical thinkers, or when you see neo in front of a word, it just means new, say that there are two different types of deterrence. So the first type of deterrence is specific deterrence. An example of specific deterrence is when someone is already in the system and they don't want to reoffend because they know that their punishment might be amplified. So for instance, you get a DUI and you get put on probation and you have to go to classes and do all of this. You are probably, if you're smart, going to be really careful not to get another DUI because your next DUI quite possibly could be time in prison. Okay, or and then we have general deterrence, and general deterrence is true for people who aren't already incarcerated or in the system, but this occurs when members of the public just to decide not to break the law because they fear that punishment. So for the most part, you get most people driving within the speed limit because they don't want a ticket. Things like that. Just people generally staying within the confines of the law because they fear that punishment, not necessarily because they have, a record or anything else like that.